For 32 years, I read fires for a living. I could walk into a burned kitchen and tell you where the lie began. A scorch does not lie. People do. Tonight, there is no fire. There is my granddaughter on my porch at 1 a.m, a bruise under her eye, a scorched tin box held against her chest. They took the others to the lake. They left Wren behind. Nothing about her story is an accident. I already knew that before she said a single word. My name is August Halloran. Most people call me Gus. 10 months ago, I turned in my kit and my credentials after 32 years as a cause and origin investigator for the county fire marshal's office. I bought a good chair. I learned for the first time in 3 decades how to sleep past the dawn. I had started to believe that the useful part of my life was behind me, folded up and put away, like a coat you no longer have the weather for. I was asleep when the knock came. Not a phone call, not a text. A knock. 3 times. Quiet but deliberate. The kind a person makes when they need very badly to be heard and are trying hard not to wake a whole street. I was on my feet before I was fully awake. 32 years of being called out to other people's worst nights does that to a man. Your body learns to move before your mind has finished the arithmetic. The hallway clock read 4 minutes past 1. I turned on the porch light before I touched the door. Old habit. You never walk into a scene blind. You look first. You read the room before you let it read you. Wren was standing on the step. She had her school backpack pulled tight over a jacket far too thin for a Cayuga Lake November. Her hair was loose and tangled from the wind that comes off the water this time of year. And she was holding something against her chest with both hands. A small tin box, dented at one corner. Its lid streaked black. Scorched. I knew the color of that black, the way other men know the faces of old friends. Under her left eye was a bruise. Yellow at the edges, darker toward the center. 4 days old, maybe 5. She was not crying. I want you to understand that. She stood straight, her chin level, both hands wrapped around that blackened tin, and she looked at me the way a person looks at a door they have been walking toward for a very long time, not certain it would open when they finally arrived. I pushed the screen door wide. "Come in," I said. She stepped past me into the hall. Della was already at the foot of the stairs. 41 years of marriage, and my wife still hears a knock before I do. She taught the 3rd grade in Hammondsport for 30 years, and she has never once needed to be told when a child is in trouble. She took one look at Wren and did what Della always does. She went straight to the person who needed something, and she did it without a single wasted word. Her hand came to rest on Wren's shoulder. She steered her gently toward the kitchen, toward the light and the warmth of the stove. I followed. Wren sat down at the table. She set the backpack on the floor beside her chair. But the tin box she kept up on the table under both hands, the way you hold on to the one thing in the world you are still sure of. Della put a pot of milk on the burner without being asked. I sat down across from my granddaughter, and I made myself slow down. "Wren," I said. "How did you get here?" "I walked," she said. I kept my face still. Our house sits on the north end of the lake. My son's place is more than 2 miles down the shore road past the vineyards, past the old boat launch that closes in October. 2 miles. Alone. In the dark. In the middle of a Finger Lakes November, when the cold comes up off the water and settles into your bones. "Does anyone know you left?" I asked. She shook her head. Della set a mug of cocoa in front of her and another in front of me, and took the chair at the end of the table. She did not rush to fill the silence. Della has always understood the difference between a moment that needs words and a moment that only needs a witness. She has sat beside me through enough hard nights to know which kind this one was. I reached over and switched on the small lamp in the center of the table. Better light. I have spent my whole life needing better light. And in it I let myself read what was in front of me the way I would have read any scene I had ever been called to. The bruise first. The color of it. The placement, high on the cheekbone, just under the eye. That is not where a face lands when a child trips on a stair. I have examined 10,000 injuries in my time, and I have learned to tell the ones a body gives itself from the ones that are given to it. Then the way she sat. Too contained. Too careful. A child rationing her own movements, as though she had learned that taking up too much space cost more than it was ever worth. Then the tin. The blackened lid. The faint smell of old smoke still living in the metal. A thing that had been in a fire and had come out the other side of it. I did not yet know what she believed about herself. That she was the one who did not fit. That in her house there was a kind of ledger, and she had come to see herself as the line they could not afford to keep. I would learn all of that in the days ahead. But even then, in the lamplight, I could feel the shape of it, the way you feel heat pressing through a closed door before you ever put your hand to the wood. "Wren," I said, and I held my voice as even as still water. "What happened to your face, sweetheart?" She met my eyes. She did not flinch. "I fell," she said. I nodded. I did not push. Not yet. You do not rush a witness. You open the door and you stand back and you let the quiet do the work. Silence is uncomfortable. People fill it. And what they choose to fill it with will tell you more than any question you could think to ask. So I waited. Della waited. The furnace ticked somewhere beneath the floor. Out past the window, the lake lay flat and black, a long sheet of glass with no moon on it. And then Wren wrapped both hands a little tighter around that scorched tin, and she asked me the question I have not stopped hearing since. "Grandpa," she said, "how long has this been going on?" She did not mean tonight. She did not mean the bruise under her eye. She did not mean the 2 miles of cold road at her back. She meant her life. I have spent a lifetime learning that the worst thing you can do in a moment like that one is answer too quickly. So I did not answer. I got up and I took the old notebook down from the shelf by the phone, the black one with the scorched cover that had ridden in my kit for the last 9 years. I carried one. I have always written things down, every scene, every account. Every small detail that seemed like nothing until it turned out to be the only thing that mattered. I sat back down. "Tell me about the lake," I said. "Start there." She looked at the tin box, then at me. "They left Thursday morning," she said. "Early. Before I woke up." There was a note on the counter. What did it say? She recited it the way you recite a thing you have read so many times it has become part of you, whether you wanted it to or not. "Gone to Lake Placid for the long weekend. Mrs. Alcott next door has a key. There is food in the refrigerator." She stopped. "That was the whole thing," she said. "No, see you soon. No, we love you. Just the information. Like a list for somebody who was coming in to water your plants." I wrote it down, word for word. "Did they tell you before Thursday?" I asked. "Any warning at all?" She shook her head. "Cooper knew. Daddy announced it at dinner on Wednesday. He said the mountain roads were not safe for younger kids in November." I kept my voice level. "Cooper is 14, I said. You are 11. That is 3 years." "I know." She turned the mug a slow half circle on the table. "I did not say anything about it, though." "Why not?" "Because the last time I said something, it did not go well." I set the pen down. "Tell me about the other times." She took a breath, and then she began to count, the way children count things they would rather not have to count. Cape May last June. 5 days at the shore. They told her the drive was too long that she got carsick, though she had never once been carsick in her life. She stayed next door with Mrs. Alcott, who is 76 and asleep by 8 o'clock. Spring break the year before that. Hilton Head. A school project, they said. A day last month driving up to see the leaves turn along the ridge, just the three of them. And before Cape May, a camping weekend in August that she only found out about afterward because she saw the photographs on her father's phone. She had scrolled through them one evening while he was in the shower. The three of them around a fire ring, Cooper's face gone orange in the light, marshmallows blackening on the ends of sticks. She had been home that whole weekend, 2 houses down at Mrs. Alcott's, believing they had only driven out to the hardware store. She did not tell me that part to make me pity her. She told it the way she told all of it, like an item entered in a column, 5 that she knew of. I wrote each one down with its date and the reason given. And I noticed the way you notice a thing your whole life has trained you to notice, that the reasons never once matched each other. Carsick, a school project, bad roads, too long a drive. 5 different excuses spread across 2 years. That is not carelessness. Careless people repeat themselves. This was someone who understood that 5 different reasons look like coincidence, and that only a pattern looks like what it truly is. Wren, I said, in any of that, was there ever an accident, something they said was your fault? She was quiet a moment. In October, there was a fire on the stove, she said. A small one. Sloan told Daddy I left the burner going under a dish towel. She looked at me. I was not even in the kitchen when it started. I did not let my face change, but I wrote that line down and I underlined it once. And something old and patient in me came awake in the dark. Has Sloan ever told you, I asked, why these things happen? In her own words? She turned the mug another slow half circle. Then she said it the way you finally set down something you have carried a very long way. She told me once they had not planned for 2 kids, that having Cooper and then adopting me was more than they had budgeted for. Not just money, everything, time, room, all of it. She paused. She was arguing with Daddy. I do not think she knew I was standing in the hall. When was that? August. About 2 weeks before the camping trip, I found out about after. She said the word budgeted the way she said all of it, flat, with no weight laid on it at all. But I have turned that word over many times since. What it does to a child to learn that she is a line in somebody's arithmetic, that a thing which can be added can just as easily be taken back out. I think that is about when she began trying to cost them less. I pressed my fist gently against the top of the table, just to give my hands something to do. 32 years, and I still have to work at that sometimes. Della reached across and laid her hand over Wren's, and Wren looked down at the 2 hands together and did not pull away. I looked at my granddaughter, 11 years old, reciting a list of the times she had been left behind, in the flat, even voice of a witness reading from a page she had gone over too many times. No tears, no outburst, just the facts, delivered by a child who had learned somewhere that showing too much cost more than it ever brought back. I will tell you honestly. There was a moment, a single moment, when the sheer calm of her frightened me a little. A stranger hearing that voice might have called it cold, might have said a child does not talk about her own life that way unless somebody has taught her the words. I understood, even as the thought came to me, how a person could take that calm and twist it into something ugly. And I understood something else in the same breath. The calm was not coldness, and it was not a script somebody had handed her. It was a ledger. She had been keeping accounts all on her own, because no one had ever once settled them for her. That, more than anything else she had told me, answered the question she had asked. How long has this been going on? All of it. The whole of it. As far back as a child that age can count. I was about to speak when the phone on the counter buzzed against the tile. I looked at the screen. Emmett. 41 minutes past 2 in the morning. Wren saw me look. Something moved across her face, quiet and complicated. And then she asked me the second question of that night. the one that landed heavier than the first. "Is that Daddy?" she said. And then before I could answer, "Is he calling to check on me or to find out where I am?" I did not answer her. We both already knew. I answered on the third ring. "Dad." Emmett's voice came through with noise behind it. Music, faint and distant, the particular acoustics of a lodge lobby at nearly 3 in the morning. All hard floors and high ceilings, bouncing sound around until everything feels slightly unreal. He sounded wide awake, which told me he had been waiting to make this call, not that the call had woken him. There is a difference. I have spent enough years reading voices to know which kind of awake I was hearing. "Is she there?" he asked. "She is here," I said. "She is safe." The relief in his exhale was real. I will give him that. Whatever else I was starting to understand in that hallway, the relief was genuine. He had been worried. That counted for something. I was not yet sure how much, but it counted. I moved out of the kitchen and pulled the door most of the way closed behind me. I could hear Della through it, her low murmur, the small sounds of someone being carefully looked after, by a person who knows how to do it without making a production of the looking after. I leaned against the wall in the dark hallway. Old family photographs hung there. Emmett at 7 with a fishing rod taller than he was. Della on our wedding day, squinting into the sun. I looked at the notebook in my hand instead. "Emmett," I said, "why did she leave?" He started talking right away. That is what people do when they have already rehearsed what comes next. They do not pause to think because the thinking is already finished. The trip had been last minute. The roads up to Lake Placid were unpredictable this time of year, and he had not been comfortable with the drive. Wren had seemed fine when they left Thursday morning. Mrs. Alcott was right next door and had agreed to check in. There was a full refrigerator and money on the counter for anything she needed. I let him finish all the way to the end. Then I said, "She walked 2 miles alone in the dark along the shore road to get here." Silence. "She is 11 years old, Emmett." "Dad, I know, but she has always been more independent than—" "She walked 2 miles," I said again, "alone at night in November, because she woke up in an empty house and did not know what else to do. Because the note on the counter told her Mrs. Alcott had a key. Not that anyone loved her. Not that anyone was coming back soon. Just that there was a key and food in the refrigerator." He was quiet for a moment. Then carefully, "I thought she was okay with it when we explained." I wrote that down. Seemed okay with it. I underlined it once and kept writing. "Emmett," I said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight. When is the last time Wren was part of a trip from the beginning? Not left with a neighbor. Not told the drive was too long, or the weather wrong, or the timing didn't work out. Actually included in the plan from the start. Present the whole time." The silence that followed ran long enough that I checked the screen to make sure the call had not dropped. "We took her to the county fair last spring," he said finally. "All 4 of us. She had a good time." I wrote it down. County fair. Spring. 8 months ago. I did not say that out loud. I did not need to. "Emmett," I said, "there is a bruise under Wren's left eye. It is 4 or 5 days old. She told me she fell." I let that sit a moment. "I am asking you directly, man to man, before I ask anything else tonight. Did you know about it before I called you just now?" The silence this time was different. Shorter, but heavier. The kind of silence that has weight you can feel through a phone line. "What bruise?" he said. I straightened away from the wall. He did not know. I was certain of it the way you become certain of things after 30 years of learning to tell the truth from every complicated thing that stands next to it. Emmett did not know about that bruise, which meant Sloan had not told him. A bruise on his daughter's face, 4 days old at minimum, and his wife had said nothing at all. I filed that away carefully, and I kept my voice exactly where it needed to be. "There is a bruise under her eye," I said. 4 days old at least. She says she fell. I am noting that for the record. Emmett said nothing for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. Quieter. Unsteady in a way I had not heard from him in years. "She didn't tell me," he said. "About the bruise. Wren didn't say anything when we left." "I know," I said. But I was not talking about Wren. Another silence, longer this time. "Come home tomorrow," I said. "Not Sunday. Tomorrow morning. And Emmett, come alone." A pause. "Sloan is not going to." "I am not asking Sloan," I said. "I am telling you. Come home tomorrow. I will be here. Wren will be here. We will talk then, the three of us, in person, without a lodge lobby echoing behind you." "Okay," he said. Quiet. Flat. The voice of a man who has just understood that something has shifted, and there is no shifting it back. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. I ended the call and stood in the dark hallway a while longer. The house was still around me. Through the kitchen door, I could hear Della talking to Wren in that low, easy way she has. The one that reminds people the world still holds a few rooms where they are safe and wanted. I looked down at the notebook. The page was filling up. I wrote 3 words at the bottom and drew a line under them twice. She did not tell him. That was the detail that kept me standing in that hallway long after the call had ended. Not the trip, not the note on the counter, not even the bruise itself. The fact that Sloan had looked at an injury on her stepdaughter's face and decided her own husband did not need to know about it. That kind of silence is never an accident. I know silence the way I know fire. It always starts somewhere, and it always starts for a reason. I went back into the kitchen. Wren looked up at me, and I could see her reading my face the same careful way I had been reading hers. Some habits, it seems, run in families, whether they are handed down in blood or not. I sat back down across from her, and I opened the notebook to a fresh page. "I have one more call to make tonight," I said. "And then, I think it is time we had some help." I reached for the phone, and I dialed a number I had not used in 10 months, one I still knew by heart. It rang twice before Duke Ferraro picked up. His voice thick with sleep and immediately alert in the particular way of a man who has spent 30 years answering calls that never come at a decent hour. "Gus," he said. "It's 3:15 in the morning." "I know what time it is, Duke," I said. "I need your help." Duke did not ask what time it was. He did not ask why I was calling at 3:15 in the morning. He just said, "Talk to me." I gave him the short version. Wren, the bruise, the pattern of trips, Sloan's silence, the address on the shore road 2 miles south where my son and his wife lived with my grandchildren. When I finished, there was a brief pause on his end. "What are you looking for?" he asked. "Everything," I said. "Start with the household. Any prior involvement with the County Department of Social Services or any other state. And Duke, this part matters. Find out if there were any other children in that home before Wren. Any other placements, any prior adoptions, anything at all." Another pause, longer this time. "How fast do you need this?" I looked at the clock above the stove. 3:17 in the morning. "As fast as you can move," I said. "Give me a few hours," he said. And he was gone. I set the phone down and started writing. There is something that happens to a man after 32 years of walking into other people's disasters. Your mind organizes information without being asked, to the way a carpenter's hands find the right angle without measuring first. I was not thinking of Wren in that moment as my granddaughter. I was thinking of her the way I had thought of 1,000 rooms I had walked into over the years. Rooms where something had happened, and somebody needed the truth of it written down before it could be argued away. I built a timeline on a clean page. Every date Wren had given me, every reason offered for every absence. The note on the counter, The county fair 8 months gone. The bruise and the silence wrapped around it. In a courtroom, or in front of a fire marshal's board, I would have called this an escalating pattern. Something small at the start, testing the walls of the room, growing bolder each time nothing pushed back. I had seen versions of it more times than I could count, in houses that had burned and in houses that had not. It always looks reasonable at the beginning. Plausible explanations. Nothing you could point to and name for what it was, not until you laid it out end to end on a single page. Then it looks exactly like what it is. I have stood in houses with 3 or 4 separate points of fire origin, and the owner swore up and down that lightning had done it, or a faulty outlet, anything under heaven except a hand with a match. The tell was never any single point. It was the spacing between them. A pattern needs room to breathe, and whoever builds one is careful never to let 2 points sit close enough for a stranger to connect them at a glance. 5 absences in 2 years, 5 separate plausible reasons, was exactly that kind of spacing. I drew a line, connecting each date on the page the way I would have marked a burn pattern on a floor plan, and sat back and looked at what the lines made. Duke called back at 17 minutes past 5. I had braced myself to wait longer. In my experience, when Duke calls back fast, the news is never simple. "Gus," he said, "you need to sit down." "I am already sitting." "There's a Department of Social Services file," he said. "Active petition. Filed 6 months ago in April to dissolve the adoption of Eleanor Wren Halloran." I did not move. Somewhere behind me, the kitchen clock kept its small, steady sound, indifferent to everything. "The petition is still open," Duke said. "It hasn't been ruled on yet. But Gus, if nobody intervenes, it moves to final review within 72 hours. I looked at the clock again. 5:18 in the morning. 72 hours meant Tuesday afternoon, less than 3 days from where I was standing. I thanked him, hung up, and sat with the notebook open in front of me for a long moment before I picked up the phone again and dialed Ada Whitfield. Ada is the best family law attorney in 3 counties, and one of perhaps 3 people alive I would trust with something like this. She billed half of what she knows watching cases I once had to certify the physical evidence for, back when fire and family court crossed paths more often than anyone liked to admit. It was 19 minutes past 5 in the morning when she answered. "Ada," I said, "it's Gus Halloran. I need you today. Not this afternoon, today. And bring everything you have on emergency custody intervention." A pause. "How bad is it?" 72 hours, I said. She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "I'll be there by 8, she said. I thanked her and set the phone down. I looked at the notebook at the timeline drawn in my own hand, at Duke's words still sitting in the air of the room. 72 hours. I had walked investigators through arson determinations in less time than that. The question now was whether I could save 1 child inside the same window. I picked the pen back up and kept writing. Della appeared in the doorway sometime after that. Her robe pulled tight her face, asking the question before her voice did. "She's asleep," she said. Finally. I sat with her until she went down. "Good," I said. Della came and stood behind my chair, and she read the page over my shoulder, the way she has read 1,000 pages over my shoulder, across 41 years. I felt her go still when she reached the line about the petition. 6 months, she said quietly. She has known about this for 6 months, and she never said a word to Emmett. That is the part I keep coming back to, I said. You should sleep an hour, Della said. You have a long day coming. I know, I said, and neither of us moved. She had said the same thing to me 100 mornings after 100 bad calls. Back when the phone ringing before dawn meant a house on fire, and a family standing in their yard watching it go. She had learned over the years that I would not go to bed. She only wanted me to hear her say it, so later she could tell herself she had tried. Wren asked me something before she fell asleep, Della said. She wanted to know if you were angry at her for leaving without telling anyone. She paused. I told her you weren't angry at her for a single thing in this world. I set the pen down. Outside the window, the sky over the lake had not yet started to lighten. It was still full dark that particular hour before dawn, when the whole world seems to be holding its breath, waiting to find out which way a thing is going to break. I thought about the tin box sitting on my kitchen table, black at the edges, holding whatever Wren had not yet shown me. I thought about a note that gave a child a key and called it care. I thought about a word, budgeted, spoken in an argument a child was never meant to overhear. 72 hours. I closed the notebook, and for the first time since the knock had come at 1 a.m, I let myself feel the size of what was in front of me. Then I opened it again, because feeling the size of a thing has never once been a reason to stop working it. Ada Whitfield arrived at 7:53 in the morning. She came through the front door with a leather bag over one shoulder, a coffee she had picked up somewhere on the drive over, and the particular focused expression she gets when she already knows a situation is serious and has spent the entire drive deciding exactly how serious. I have known Ada for close to 20 years. That expression means she slept 4 hours and is running now on caffeine and professional instinct, which in her case has always been more than enough. I took her into the kitchen. Della had made a full pot of coffee and set out a plate of toast before taking herself quietly out to the porch, which is what Della does when a room needs to belong to the work and not to the household around it. I walked Ada through everything: the timeline, the petition, the 72 hours, Duke's findings so far, the bruise, the call with Emmett. She listened without once interrupting, which is one of the things I have always respected in her. She takes the whole of a thing in before she starts shaping a response. Most people do it the other way around. When I finished, she opened her bag and pulled out a legal pad of her own. We file for emergency guardianship today, she said. Before noon if we can manage it. I can have the petition drafted within the hour. But Gus, we need documented evidence of the pattern. Dates, incidents, anything that isn't just your notes and hers. I know, I said. I am working on that. We were still talking through it when we heard footsteps on the stairs. Slow, careful. The kind of footsteps that belong to someone who is not entirely sure they are welcome in the room they are walking toward. Wren appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was wearing the same clothes from the night before. Her hair had been brushed, which told me Della had been up with her earlier that morning. She was carrying the tin box in both hands, held out in front of her, the way you carry something you have already made a decision about and do not intend to unmake. She looked at me, then at Ada, then back at me. This is Ada, I said. She's a lawyer. She's helping us. Wren nodded slowly. She stepped into the kitchen and set the tin down on the table between us. She did not open it right away. She stood with both hands flat on the lid and looked at me with an expression I recognized, though it took me a moment to place it. It was the look of a person about to hand over evidence they have carried alone for a long time, making certain the room is ready to receive it. I've been collecting since September, she said. I didn't know who to give it to until now. She lifted the lid. The scorch marks ran deeper on the inside than they had shown on the outside. A dark bloom across the metal that told me this tin had sat very close to real heat at some point. Closer than a kitchen accident usually allows. I filed that away without saying it out loud. The first thing she took out was an old digital camera, small and outdated, the kind schools give out for photography units and nobody ever returns. She turned it on and passed it across the table. I scrolled through the photo library. Dozens of images organized by the camera's own internal clock, going back 14 months. Dinners where her plate was noticeably smaller than the others. A family calendar taped to the refrigerator trips, marked in blue ink, her name absent from every single one. A photograph of the kitchen counter from the morning they left for Lake Placid, The note sitting there alone, beneath a coffee mug the refrigerator stocked in a way that spoke of maintenance and not of love. One image stopped me longer than the rest. Cooper's youth hockey team lined up on the ice at some rink I did not recognize. A banner behind them reading, Regional Qualifier, in block letters, and a date stamped in the corner by the camera's own clock. Wren had taken it from the stands, half of Sloane's shoulder visible at the edge of the frame. I did not know yet what that single photograph would come to mean. I only knew, the way you know a nail before you know what it will hold, that it was the kind of detail worth keeping. "Why'd you take that one?" I asked her. She shrugged, small and unbothered. "I don't know. I just took pictures of days, even the ones I wasn't in." I set the camera down and turned instead to the notebook. The handwriting inside was small and deliberate. Each entry carried a date. Each one described a specific incident in plain, factual language, the way an 11-year-old writes when she is trying very hard to be believed. October 4th. Sloane said the fall class photos were only for family members who wanted one. October 19th. Cooper's hockey game. Whole family went. I was told I had too much homework. November 2nd. Heard Sloane tell Daddy the trip was already booked for 2 people, and adding me would change the room. I read 3 pages without looking up. Ada was reading over my shoulder, and I heard her set her coffee cup down very quietly. Wren reached into the tin one more time and brought out a white envelope sealed. She held it a moment before setting it on top of the notebook. "That one's just for me," she said. "I wrote it so I wouldn't forget, in case nobody believed me later." I looked at the envelope. I did not touch it. "You don't have to share that one," I said. She shook her head. "You can read it. I want you to." I opened it carefully. Inside was a single folded page, 3 paragraphs, in the same small, careful hand. She had written down every incident she could remember, going back to the camping trip she had learned about from photographs on her father's phone. At the bottom, in slightly larger letters, she had written one sentence. "I have not been able to stop turning over since." I am not making this up. I just need someone to finally read it. The kitchen was very quiet. Ada picked up her legal pad, and her pen was already moving before she spoke. "I want you to understand what I'm looking at," Ada said, not to me, but to Wren, gently, the way she must speak to clients who have never sat across a lawyer's desk before. "This notebook has dates going back to September. That camera has its own internal clock, separate from anything anyone could have told you to say. A court does not have to take my word for what happened in that house, or your grandfather's word, or even yours alone. It can look at the evidence you built, one day at a time, and see the shape of it for itself." She turned back to me. "Gus," she said, her voice completely level. "This child just handed us the case." I looked at Wren, standing on the other side of the table, with her empty tin and her careful watching eyes. "You did good, sweetheart," I said. "You did real good." She nodded once. Then she pulled out a chair and reached for a piece of toast, the way a person reaches for something ordinary once the hardest thing they have ever done is finally finished. Dr. Ambrose Kettering has been our family physician for 12 years. He is 61, soft-spoken, with the particular quality of stillness the best doctors seem to grow into over time. The kind that makes a patient feel like their appointment is the only thing in the world he has scheduled that day, even when his waiting room is full to the door. I called him that morning and told him I needed to bring Wren in. I did not explain why over the phone. Some conversations need a room, not a wire. We arrived at his office on Pulteney Street a little before 11. Wren sat on the exam table in her jeans and a soft gray sweater Della had found for her that morning, slightly too large, the sleeves folded twice at the cuff. She answered Dr. Kettering's questions in the same careful, measured way she had answered mine the night before. Yes, she was eating. Yes, she was sleeping, mostly. No, nothing else hurt. He examined the bruise under her left eye with a small penlight. He asked her to follow it with her gaze. He asked her what had happened. "I fell," she said. "At school. I tripped on the stairs by the gym." He asked which day. She said Monday. He asked which staircase. She told him without hesitation the exact one. He finished the exam and asked if she would mind waiting in the front for a few minutes. There was a fish tank out there, he told her, and he had some paperwork to go over with her grandfather. Wren looked at me before she slid off the table. I gave her a small nod, and she went. Dr. Kettering closed the door. "The bruise is inconsistent with a fall on stairs," he said. "The angle, the location, the way the discoloration sits along the bone. That pattern suggests direct contact from something at close range." He paused. "Or someone." "I know," I said. He looked at me carefully. "Gus, how long has she been in that household?" 2 years, I said. "A little over." He nodded, opened a drawer, and took out a form. "I'm going to document this properly," he said. "Photographs, measurements, my clinical assessment. You'll have a copy before you leave today." I thanked him. I told him everything Wren had shared the night before. The pattern, the trips, the note on the counter. He listened the way he listens to symptoms, without judgment, with his full attention. And he wrote for several minutes after I finished. 2 years, he said again, half to himself, setting his pen down. I saw her for a well visit back in the spring. Nothing like this. No bruising, no signs of anything. He looked up at me. "That tells you something too, Gus. Whatever is happening in that house did not start at the beginning. It grew into itself." I asked if he could say how the pattern had changed since spring. He said he would pull her chart and compare that a clinical record does not forget what a family sometimes hopes it will. "This will hold up," he said simply. "Whatever you need it for." We left his office a little after noon, and I had a folder in my briefcase that felt different from every other piece of paper I had ever carried out of that building. Lighter somehow, and heavier at the same time. I took Wren down to the lake after that. Not home. Not yet. There is a small public landing off the county road, a strip of gravel and a bench worn silver by weather, where the water opens out wide enough that you can see clear across to the far shore on a bright day. It was not bright. It was the kind of gray November afternoon this part of New York does better than anywhere I have ever lived. Sky and water nearly the same color. A thin mist sitting just above the surface, like the lake was breathing. We sat on the bench. Wren pulled her knees up and wrapped her arms around them. A pair of loons moved slow and quiet near the far bank. Somewhere behind us, a truck downshifted on the hill road, and then it was quiet again. I did not bring the notebook. I left it in the truck on purpose. Sometimes the most important conversations happen when the other person does not feel like they are being interviewed. We talked about school for a while. Her favorite subject was history, which did not surprise me. She said she liked the way it moved in one direction, the way you could follow it back and always find where a thing had started. I told her I had felt something close to that about fire investigation once. She asked if that was why I chose it. I said partly. She thought about that for a while. Then, in the easy quiet that had settled between us, she said something I realized later I had been waiting for, without knowing I was waiting. "Sloan used to tell me I was lucky," she said. "That they chose me, and not everybody gets chosen." She picked at a thread on her sleeve. She'd say it like I owed her something for it. Like I shouldn't need anything because I was already using up my share just by being there. I kept my eyes on the water. "How did that make you feel?" She thought about it honestly, the way she seemed to think about everything. Like being chosen was something I had to keep earning, she said. Like it could get taken back. I let that sit between us for a moment, out over the gray water. I thought of every witness I had ever watched testify to something they had rehearsed so many times the rehearsal had become the memory. And I thought of how different this was. An 11-year-old girl working out loud in real time what a sentence had cost her, without anyone ever having taught her the word for it. "It isn't true," I said. "None of it. Not one part of it is something you earned or owed." She did not answer that. She only nodded once, the way you nod at something you are willing to consider, but are not yet ready to fully believe. "Is there anything else?" I said carefully. "About the bruise, or about that fire in October that you didn't tell me last night? You don't have to answer, but I'd rather know now than have it surprise us later." She was quiet a long moment. A loon called somewhere out on the water, and the mist moved a little in the wind coming off the surface. "In October," she said, "we were in the kitchen. I'd knocked over a glass by accident, and Sloane grabbed my arm, hard. She told me to be more careful." She paused. "That's when the bruise happened. Not at school. Not this Monday. That day." I looked at her. "You told Dr. Kettering it was the stairs." She nodded, still watching the water. "I know. I didn't think anyone would believe the other thing. I did not reach for the notebook. I did not need it." I sat with that sentence a long moment, the particular feeling that comes when a child finally tells you the truth after practicing a lie long enough that she had almost started to believe it herself. We sat there a while longer without talking. The loons made their slow way toward the far shore. Then my phone buzzed against my leg. A message from Ada. "Gus. Sloane has retained Roland Thorne." I knew that name. Family law out of Corning. Aggressive, expensive, and very good at making the other side look like the problem. Sloane was not waiting for Tuesday. She was already moving. Duke called back a little after 6 that evening. I was on the back porch, the cold coming up hard off the water, now that the sun had gone down behind the ridge. My coat pulled tight, and the lake gone the color of pewter. "There are 2 smart home devices registered to the house on the shore road," Duke said, without preamble, which is how Duke has always spoken when the information he is carrying has weight to it. "A speaker in the living room, a hub in the kitchen. Both active for the last 14 months. Both registered to an account in Sloane's name, not Emmett's." I leaned against the porch railing and looked out at the dark water. "Can she access the kitchen device remotely?" I asked. "From Lake Placid, say." "From anywhere she has a signal," Duke said. "And Gus, one more thing. That kitchen device has an ambient recording feature. If it was enabled, it would have picked up nearly everything said in that room within 30 feet. I thought of the morning Wren had opened the tin box on that very kind of counter in that very kind of kitchen, though the thought did not settle where I expected it to. It settled somewhere colder. "There's something else," Duke said. His voice changed, then dropped into a register I had heard from him only a handful of times across the years we had known each other, back when he was still carrying a badge and had to be the one to say a hard thing out loud to someone who did not yet know they needed to hear it. "There was a girl before Wren." I did not say anything. I let him keep going. "Marisol Vega," he said. "Placed with Emmett and Sloane through county adoption services in the spring of 2018. She was 7. The adoption finalized that fall. In January of 2021, Sloane filed a petition to dissolve it, citing severe behavioral issues incompatible with the family environment. The petition was granted 4 months later. Marisol went back into foster care that May, at 9 years old. She's 14 now, living with a foster family up in Syracuse. 3rd placement since the dissolution. I stood very still on that porch, the cold working its way into my hands, and I felt something shift into place, the way it shifts when you walk a fire scene long enough, and the separate, senseless details finally arrange themselves into a single, terrible sentence. "There's a note in the county file," Duke went on. "A caseworker flagged the dissolution for review, said the behavioral issues Sloane cited weren't supported by the girl's school records or by her teacher's own assessments. They described her as quiet, cooperative. The review got opened, and then it got closed 6 months later, when the caseworker was reassigned and nobody picked it back up. "Do you have a current address for her?" I asked. "I do," Duke said. "With her foster family's permission, I could try to set up a call." "Do that," I said. "Please." I ended the call and stood there a long while in the dark. The porch boards cold under my boots, my breath going out in front of me in slow, pale clouds. I thought about the word Wren had used, sitting on the bench by the lake that afternoon. Lucky. Chosen. As though love in that house were a prize handed out once at the door and never renewed again. I had assumed, foolishly, that the word was hers alone, something she had built for herself out of a child's private arithmetic. It was not hers. It belonged to Sloane. It had likely belonged first to a 7-year-old girl in a different kitchen, a different year, before it was ever handed down to Wren at all. A phrase worn smooth from use, the way a stone in a riverbed gets worn smooth by water that has passed over it 1,000 times before you ever touch it yourself. She had done this before, not a mistake. Not a family that had tried and found itself overwhelmed the way any family might. A method. A child brought in, kept for a span of time, and then removed once she became inconvenient enough to justify the paperwork. And somewhere in the middle of that method, a system that had noticed something was wrong, and then had looked away. I thought of the kitchen fire in October. The dish towel Wren was blamed for leaving too close to a burner she had never been standing at. I have spent 32 years reading the places where fires start, and I know the difference in my bones between a flame that finds its own way into being and one that is carried there by a hand that means for it to catch. I did not have physical evidence of that fire any longer. It was long since cleaned up, the towel long since thrown away. But I knew, the way I have known certain things across the whole of my working life, low in my chest, before the mind has caught up to name it. Sloane had set that fire, and then she had handed the blame for it to an 11-year-old girl who had not even been standing in the room. She had built her method once already on a 7-year-old named Marisol Vega, and it had worked well enough that she had simply built it again. I do not know how long I stood on that porch. Long enough that Della found me there and did not ask what was wrong, only came and stood beside me, her shoulder against my arm, the two of us looking out at a lake we could no longer see. "Tell me," she said after a while. And I did, in the fewest words I could manage, because there was no way to make the shape of it smaller than it was. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. When she finally spoke, her voice had gone very low. "That poor girl," she said. "The first one." Then after another silence, "You have to find her, Gus. Not just for the case. Somebody ought to tell her, after all this time, that none of it was ever her fault either." "I know," I said. I went inside sometime after that. The house was quiet. Wren had gone up an hour before, worn through from the length of the day. I did not wake her. I went instead to my desk, where the tin box sat where she had left it that morning, its lid still open, the scorch marks catching the lamplight. I took my handkerchief from my pocket, and I began very carefully to wipe the soot from the inside of that lid. It did not need cleaning. There was no reason in the world to do it at 3 o'clock in the morning. Working the cloth into the corners of a burned tin box that had already told me everything it had to tell. But I did it anyway, slow and thorough, the way I have cleaned instruments after every hard scene I ever worked, because my hands needed something honest to do, while the rest of me sat with what a grown woman had been willing to do to a child, twice, in 2 different houses, 2 different decades apart. A method. Not a mistake. I set the handkerchief down, closed the tin gently, and finally, sometime after 4, I slept. The call came at 47 minutes past 2 the following afternoon. I was sitting in my truck outside Ada's office on Liberty Street, going through the draft petition she had prepared that morning. 3 questions marked in the margins where I wanted to be certain of the wording. When the name lit up on the screen, I set the pages face down on the passenger seat. I reached into my coat pocket, took out the small recorder I had been carrying since Saturday morning, and switched it on before I answered. "Hello, Sloan," I said. "James." Her voice was warm, and even finished smooth, the way good wood is finished, nothing rough anywhere, nothing a person could catch a splinter on if they were not paying close attention. Nobody has called me James since my own mother passed. Sloan has always used it. I have never once told her to stop. I wanted to check in. Emmett told me Wren is with you. I'm so relieved she's safe. She is, I said. She must have been terrified, Sloan said. Walking all that way alone in the dark? I feel just awful that she felt she needed to do that. We thought she was comfortable with the arrangement for the weekend. We truly did. I let the silence sit there a moment before I answered. 32 years of interviews taught me that silence is a tool, not an absence, and that the people most practiced at performing calm are usually the ones least able to sit inside somebody else's. I'm sure you did, I said. I'd love to come get her tomorrow morning if that works, Sloan went on. Give her a chance to settle back in before school on Monday. She does better with routine, you know that. I don't think that's going to work, I said. A pause. The first one. Is everything all right? That depends, I said. Sloan, I want to ask you something directly. Are you familiar with a case number DSS-New York-2024-4471? The pause that followed ran 4 full seconds. I counted every one of them. I'm not sure I know what you're referring to, she said. Her voice had not moved a fraction. That, more than anything, told me how many times she had rehearsed for exactly this kind of question. That's the petition you filed with the County Department of Social Services this past April, I said, to dissolve the adoption of Eleanor Wren Halloran, your daughter. The silence ran longer this time. James, she said finally. Family situations are complicated. You of all people understand that. I think what we all want at the end of the day is what's genuinely best for Wren. I'm sure that if we approach this like reasonable adults, we can find an arrangement that works for everyone. I have heard a great many things dressed up in careful language over the years. Threats wearing the coat of concern. Warnings folded neatly into offers of goodwill. This was both at once delivered in the voice of a woman who had practiced it until it felt like the truth to her own ear. She was not proposing a compromise. She was telling me to step back and framing the telling as something reasonable between 2 sensible people. I'm sure we can, I said. Wonderful, she said. I knew you'd understand. Emmett speaks so highly of you, James. He really does. I ended the call not long after and sat in the truck without moving, the cold coming in through the door seam. Liberty Street going about its ordinary Sunday business outside the windshield. I thought about the shape of every sentence she had built. Warm for Emmett. Warm even when she said my name. Cold the moment the subject turned to Wren. A single degree of ice sliding under words that were otherwise dressed exactly the same. I picked the petition papers back up, and my eye caught on something Ada had photocopied for the file. An incident report Sloan had submitted to the school in October, describing an unsupervised afternoon where Wren had allegedly wandered off from a family outing at the county fairgrounds. The date at the top of the page stopped me. I reached for my own notes, the ones I had copied from Wren's green notebook the day before. October 19th. Cooper's hockey game. Whole family went. I pulled up the photograph on the old camera, the one Wren had taken from the stands. The banner reading Regional Qualifier. The date stamped in the corner by the camera's own clock. October 19th. The incident report Sloan had filed placed the whole family at the fairgrounds that same afternoon. Wren included wandering off on her own. But the photograph placed all four of them on ice 40 minutes away at exactly that hour. Sloane's own shoulder visible at the edge of the frame. It was not simply that the report was unfair to Wren. It was fabricated. Built from a date that did not belong to it, filed to create a paper trail suggesting a child who could not be trusted to stay where she was put. I sat very still in the cab of my truck, the two documents side by side on the seat beside me, and I understood that I was no longer looking at a woman who had merely favored one child over another. I was looking at a woman assembling a case file of her own, one lie at a time. The same careful method she must have used on a 7-year-old girl in Syracuse 6 years before. She had ever turned it on Wren. There was something almost professional in it, in the way she must think of herself. Not as someone doing harm, but as someone managing a difficult situation responsibly, the way I once managed a scene cataloging and labeling, until the story told itself without her having to say a single false word aloud. The difference between us, I understood then, sitting in that cold truck, was that I had spent 32 years learning to read what a fire actually did. She had spent hers learning to write down what she wanted people to believe it had done. I picked up my phone and called Duke. "One more thing," I said when he answered. "I need you to find out everything you can about whether that kitchen device can be pulled for a preservation order before she has any reason to think to delete it." "On it," Duke said. "Gus, what did you find?" "A false report," I said, "with a date that doesn't hold up against a photograph a 14-year-old took from a hockey rink." Duke was quiet a moment. "That's not carelessness," he said. "No," I said, "it isn't." Emmett arrived at 13 minutes past 2 the next afternoon. He pulled into the driveway and sat in his car for nearly 2 full minutes before he got out. I watched from the front window. I did not go to the door until I heard his footsteps on the porch boards. He looked like a man who had not slept. His eyes were red at the rims. He was wearing the same jacket he had left in on Thursday, which told me he had not gone back to the house before driving here. He had come straight from wherever he had spent the night. I noted that. Old habit. You read what a person is wearing the way you read a burn pattern for what it can tell you before a single word gets said. "Is she here?" he asked. "Is she okay?" "She's upstairs," I said. "She's fine. Come inside." I brought him into the front room instead of the kitchen. I had thought about that choice on the drive back from Ada's office the night before. The kitchen was not the right room for what needed to happen next. I sat him on the couch and took the chair across from him. Between us, on the low table, sat a manila folder I had prepared that morning. I did not open it right away. "Dad," he said, "I want to explain." "I know," I said. "But first I need you to look at something." I slid the folder across the table. Inside was the Marisol Vega file, placement records, the dissolution petition, the caseworkers flagged, review. A page of Marisol's school records showing no behavioral concerns of any kind, and a small photograph clipped to the front. A 7-year-old girl with dark braids and a careful, hopeful smile. The kind of smile a child gives when she is trying hard to make a good impression on people she has only just met. Emmett picked up the photograph. He looked at it a long time. "I didn't know about her," he said quietly, without any defense in his voice at all. "I swear to you, Dad, I didn't know she existed." I watched his face while he said it. I believed him. That was the part that made everything harder, not easier. It would have been simpler in a way if he had known. A man who knowingly stood by would have been a man I could put somewhere in my own accounting and be done with. This was worse. This was a son who had built a whole marriage on the habit of not asking, and had told himself all the while that trust was the same thing as attention. It is not. I had learned that lesson myself, in my own way, long before Emmett was ever born. Though I had never once found the words to pass it down to him. "How is that possible?" I asked. You went through the adoption process together. There would have been home visits, interviews, paperwork with both your names on it. Sloan handled all of it, he said. The agency visits, the calls. She said her schedule was more flexible than mine. I signed what she put in front of me. He said it plainly, without trying to make it sound like anything other than what it was, which meant he already understood it was not an excuse. I looked at my son. 39 years old, a man I had raised to be better than a person who hands the running of his own household to somebody else and stops asking questions. Emmett, I said, the bruise on Wren's face. What did Sloan tell you when you asked her about it Saturday night? He closed his eyes briefly. She said Wren bumped into a door at school and didn't mention it because she didn't want to make a fuss. She said Wren does that sometimes, makes small things into big things and lets big things disappear, whichever suits her. I wrote nothing down. I did not need to. Make small things into big things. The language of someone who has spent a long time building a particular story about a child for the benefit of everyone standing around her. Emmett, I said, when is the last time you made a decision about Wren on your own, without Sloan framing the situation first? He thought about that for an uncomfortably long time. I used to read to her, he said finally, when she first came to us. She liked the same book 3 nights running sometimes, and I never minded. He stopped. I stopped doing that about a year ago. Sloan said Wren was old enough to read alone, that I was creating an unhealthy dependency. He looked down at his hands. I believed her. I believed most of what she told me. It just got easier to let her handle things than to keep asking questions she always had a ready answer for. I let that sit in the room a moment. Emmett, I said. I filed for emergency guardianship of Wren yesterday morning. He looked up. I have documentation of a pattern going back 14 months, I said. Medical records, dated photographs, written accounts in Wren's own hand. And I have the Marisol Vega file which you are holding right now. He went very still. I am not doing this to punish you, I said. I am doing it because your daughter walked 2 miles alone in the dark to get to my door, and she asked me if she was going to be sent back. I could not answer her. I need to be able to answer her now. Emmett looked down at the photograph of Marisol Vega on the table between us. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I had heard it in years. What do I do, Dad? He said. Tell me what to do. I reached across and put my hand on his arm, the same way I had when he was 7 years old and had broken a neighbor's window and did not know how to face it. You choose your daughter, I said. Whatever that costs you, you put her first. He nodded slowly at first. Then with something steadier underneath it, he stayed another 40 minutes. We did not talk about Sloan, or about lawyers, or about what came next. We talked about Wren, about the book she used to ask for 3 nights running, about the way she had held that scorched tin box on my kitchen table with both hands, like she was not certain how long she would be allowed to stay. At one point, he asked if he could see her before he left, and I told him, not yet. Not until we had a plan we could stand behind without stumbling. He accepted that more easily than I expected him to, which told me something too, that some part of him had already begun trusting my judgment, the way he once had as a boy, before Sloan had taught him to route every decision through her first. He asked instead if I would tell Wren he had come. I said I would tell her exactly that, and exactly why he had left without seeing her, so that she would understand it as care, and not as one more absence added to her ledger. When he left, he shook my hand at the door. He had not done that since he was a teenager, trying hard to seem older than he was. Sometimes a handshake is the most honest thing 2 people have left to offer each other. I watched his car back down the driveway and turned toward the shore road. Then I went inside and called Ada. We have Emmett, I said. Ada called at 23 minutes past 8 that evening. She did not say hello. She said, "Gus, I just received something from Thorne's office, and you need to hear it." I was at my desk. Wren was asleep down the hall. Della was reading in the bedroom, and the house had gone quiet in the particular way it does when everyone under its roof is carrying something heavy and has agreed, without ever discussing it, to carry it privately for a few hours. "Open your email," Ada said. "I'm sending it now." I turned to the laptop. The message arrived within seconds, one line from Ada in the subject field. 4 words. "Read this before anything." Attached was a forwarded message from Roland Thorne's office, sent at 7:51 that evening. The language was formal and precise, the way Thorne apparently always wrote. Every word placed exactly where he wanted it to land. He intended to file a motion the following morning, alleging that I had engaged in coaching a minor child. He cited a recorded conversation as evidence. He had attached an audio file. He recommended I withdraw my petition immediately, or the motion would be entered into the record. There was a second attachment as well, one Ada had not mentioned. An emergency motion to return Wren to the family home, pending resolution of the guardianship matter, filed to be heard first thing Tuesday morning, before our own hearing could even begin. Thorne was not content to discredit me. He meant to have Wren back in that house before the 72 hours ever ran out. I opened the audio file. I heard my own voice first, then Wren's. The kitchen the morning she had opened the tin box, Ada seated across the table from us. The recording had been captured cleanly, every word audible, the way a good device captures sound in a small room when it has been positioned with care. Positioned, I thought, not merely present. A phone left face up on a counter catches sound by accident. This did not sound like an accident. It sounded like something aimed. I listened to the full 3 minutes and 40 seconds without moving. I heard myself ask Wren about the October fire. I heard her answer, calm and precise, the way she answers everything. Stripped of the hour that had come before it, stripped of the fact that every word she said matched an entry already written in a green notebook weeks before I ever arrived, it did sound, I will admit, like a man leading a child toward the answers he wanted. I understood listening to it, exactly how a stranger, unfamiliar with any of us, could hear something damning in 3 minutes that meant something else entirely across the whole of a morning. When it ended, I sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and I thought of every case I had ever worked where a single frame cut from its context had been made to testify to something the whole of the evidence did not support. Then I called Ada. "How bad is it?" she asked immediately. I thought about the question carefully before I answered. "Bad enough if you hear it without the context," I said. The recording starts after Wren had already been talking for several minutes. It picks up right where I'm asking her specific questions about specific incidents. Without what came before, it sounds like I'm steering her toward particular answers, which is exactly what Thorne intends to argue. "Yes," Ada said. "He'll say I brought Wren to my house, isolated her from her parents, and spent the morning coaching her on what to tell investigators in the court. He'll say everything in that tin box was assembled under my direction. He'll say the dates on those notebook pages can't be independently verified." I paused. "And now there's the emergency motion. He wants her back in that house before Tuesday." Silence on the line. Then, how do we counter it? I looked across my desk at the tin box, sitting where Wren had left it days before. I had not moved it. I had been looking at it on and off for 2 days without fully understanding why. Now I understood. "Ada," I said, "that box. Every photograph on that camera. Every entry in that notebook. Every page of that letter she wrote to herself. All of it was created before I ever arrived here. Wren started collecting in September. I didn't know she existed as a granddaughter in trouble until 1 o'clock Saturday morning. That's a 2-month gap that has nothing whatsoever to do with me. A pause. Then Ada said, "We need to prove that independently. A grandfather's word that a granddaughter's notebook is old won't hold up against emotion this aggressive. We need something outside of us." "The photographs will have metadata," I said. "A timestamp embedded by the camera itself at the moment each picture was taken. Not something either of us typed in afterward. Not something anyone can argue was coached, because the machine that made the record has no motive of its own. The notebook entries are handwritten and dated, but we'd want a handwriting analysis to confirm they weren't written recently and backdated to look older than they are." "Get both," Ada said. "Tonight if you can manage it. I have a technology consultant who can pull camera metadata by morning, and I know a document examiner in Rochester who owes me a favor from a case I'd rather not describe over the phone." "Already thinking it," I said. "What about the emergency motion?" I heard her exhale the particular sound she makes when she is already 3 steps ahead of whatever she is about to say out loud. "It's aggressive," she said, "even for Thorne. Filing for return of the child before the guardianship hearing even happens, on the strength of a coaching allegation he hasn't proven yet. That's not a legal strategy, so much as it's an attempt to change the facts on the ground before a judge ever gets a real look at them. If Wren goes back into that house, even for a single night before Tuesday, everything gets harder. The narrative shifts. It becomes about moving her back and forth, instead of about what's true." "Then we don't let it happen," I said. "No," Ada said. "We don't." My phone buzzed against the desk. A second call coming through. I looked at the screen. Sloan Halloran. "Ada," I said. "She's calling me right now on the other line." "Do not answer it," Ada said, quick and firm. I looked at the name lit up against the dark of the screen a moment longer. "I'm going to answer it," I said. I reached into the drawer, took out the recorder, set it on the desk in front of me, and pressed the small red button. Before I switched lines. "Hello, Sloan," I said. "James." Her voice was different from the afternoon call. The warm finish was still there, but something underneath it had changed. A tightness at the edges that had not been present before. "I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot here," she said. "And I'd like to correct that before things go any further in a direction that's bad for everyone." I said nothing. I let the silence work. "You're making a mistake," she said. The tone shifted, still controlled, but with something colder moving beneath it now. "Emmett will come back to me. He always does. And when he does, you will never see that girl again. I want you to understand that clearly." I looked at the recorder on my desk, the small red light blinking steady in the dark of the room. "Thank you, Sloan," I said quietly. That was the last piece I needed. I ended the call and sat a long while in the silence of my study. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard settled, the old wood contracting against the cold coming down off the lake. And for a moment, the sound of it was the only thing in the world. I thought about the word she had used. Understand. As though a threat, delivered evenly enough in a voice practiced enough, might pass itself off as clarity between reasonable people. I have sat across a table from men who set fires to collect on insurance. Men who spoke in that same reasonable register right up until the moment the evidence closed around them. And I have learned that the smoothness of a voice tells you nothing at all about what is underneath it. Sometimes it tells you the opposite. Then I called Ada back. "Play the recording you just made," she said before I could say a word. "I already am," I said. Ada called again at 2:04 in the morning. I had not slept. I was still at my desk with the recorder and the notebook and a cup of coffee gone cold sometime around midnight. I had been going over the petition draft, reading the same 3 paragraphs without absorbing a single word of them. I picked up on the first ring. "Gus," Ada said. "I need you to listen carefully." "I'm listening," I said. I set the papers aside and picked up my pen. "I've spent the last 5 hours going through everything in that tin box," she said. "Every photograph on that camera, Every page of the notebook, the letter, all of it. While I was working, I had my technology consultant pull the metadata off every image. He finished an hour ago. I have his report in front of me right now. I sat forward. Every single image has an embedded timestamp, recorded automatically by the camera at the moment the photograph was taken, she said. The earliest relevant image was taken September 14th. The most recent taken before Thursday morning is dated November 1st. The dates are entirely consistent with the notebook entries. They corroborate each other independently, with no possibility of coordination, because the metadata is written into the file by the device itself and can't be altered without leaving a trace. I started writing. One photograph taken September 14th shows the family calendar on the refrigerator in that kitchen, she went on. A weekend trip marked in blue ink. Cooper's name in the entry. Wren's name isn't there. That photograph was taken 8 weeks before you ever arrived in this story. 8 weeks before anyone called you. Before Wren ever knocked on your door. I stopped writing and just listened. The notebook, Ada said. I had a document examiner review photographs of every page tonight. His preliminary assessment is that the entries are consistent with being written over an extended period, not composed in a single sitting. The ink varies across entries, consistent with different pens on different occasions. The handwriting itself shifts subtly, entry to entry, the way anyone's hand shifts over weeks and months. His conclusion is that these were not written recently and backdated. They were written when they say they were written. I set my pen down. And the letter, Ada said. The one she sealed and wrote to herself. The paper has a crease pattern consistent with being folded and unfolded repeatedly over a period of weeks. Someone opened that letter and read it more than once. Someone carried it around and came back to it. That is not what a document looks like when it was written last week. I looked down the hall toward the tin box sitting on my desk in the lamplight, and I thought of the morning she had set it down between us, both hands still resting on the lid. The particular stillness of a person about to hand over the one thing they had built entirely on their own. I had spent 32 years learning to read the places where a fire begins, learning to separate the flame that starts itself from the one carried in by a hand that means for it to catch. I understood. Sitting there in the lamplight at 2 a.m, that Wren had been doing something very close to the same work in her own kitchen, with nothing but a school camera and a green notebook for 2 months before anyone thought to ask her a single question. She had not waited to be rescued. She had built her own record of the fire before I ever knew there was one to read. There's one more thing, Ada said. I went back and listened to the Thorne recording again. The section he intends to use in court where you're asking Wren about specific incidents. I mapped every single incident she describes in that recording against the dated entries in her notebook. Gus, every incident she names appears in that notebook, in her own handwriting, weeks or months before you ever arrived. She wasn't repeating information you'd given her. She was describing things she'd already recorded independently, long before you were ever involved. The room was entirely quiet. Thorne's motion is built on the argument that you constructed this case, Ada said. That box destroys that argument completely and permanently. Wren didn't need you to tell her what was happening to her. She already knew. She'd been keeping track of it herself since September, because she understood something most adults take years of hard experience to learn. That the truth by itself isn't always enough, I said. Yes, Ada said quietly. She understood that the people who held power over her life would find a way to explain away anything she said, unless she could show them something they couldn't explain away, I said. So she documented it systematically, over months alone in a green notebook she kept in a scorched tin box, because she was 11 years old and afraid that when the moment finally came, No one would believe her without proof. "I'll make sure the court understands exactly that," Ada said. I ended the call and sat a while longer at my desk. Then I got up and walked down the hall, past the closed door of the guest room, where I could hear Wren's slow, even breathing on the other side. Asleep. Which was the best possible thing she could be doing at 2 a.m, with the last of the hours before the hearing running down around all of us. I have sent men and women into rooms that changed the shape of their lives. I have signed off on findings that put people behind bars, findings that cleared people the world had already decided were guilty. I had always believed that reading a scene correctly was the most important thing I could offer anyone. Standing outside that door, I had to press one hand flat against the wall to keep from feeling the full weight of what a child had been made to do alone in order to be believed. Then I walked back to my desk, sat down, and went back to work. There were not many hours left. The Steuben County Courthouse in Bath opens at 8:30 in the morning. I had been inside that building more times than I could count over the years, testifying on fire cause and origin, in civil suits, in insurance disputes, in the rare criminal matter where arson stood at the center of things. I had never once walked through those doors as a grandfather, trying to keep his granddaughter from being sent back into a house before a judge had a real chance to look at what that house actually was. Ada was waiting for me in the hallway outside the courtroom, a leather folder under one arm, her expression carrying the particular energy of a lawyer who has not slept, but is running on something stronger than coffee. Preparation. "We're on first," she said. Judge Bishop moved another matter to make room. She read both filings this morning, the emergency motion and our opposition. "And she's hearing them together," Ada said. We went over it once more, standing in that hallway. The metadata report, the handwriting analysis, the recording of Sloane's call, the Marisol Vega file, Emmett's signed statement 3 pages in his own hand, which he had sent to Ada by email before dawn. Judge Coretta Bishop took the bench at 9:09. 56 years old, 22 years on the family court bench, a reputation for moving matters forward without patience for arguments she considered weak. She looked at both filings a long moment before she spoke. "Mr. Thorne," she said, "your motion rests entirely on a single recording presented without its surrounding context. Ms. Whitfield's response addresses that recording directly, along with independent forensic evidence regarding its origin. I'll hear the response first." Ada walked the court through the metadata in under 5 minutes. Clean, precise, no wasted language. The photographs predating my involvement by 8 weeks at minimum. The handwriting analysis, the crease pattern on the letter. She built it the way you build a structure, one supported layer at a time. Nothing set down until what came beneath it could hold the weight. Thorne's argument ran 11 minutes. He was good at his work, I will give him that. Confident and unhesitating, even as the ground beneath his motion had shifted considerably since he filed it the night before. Judge Bishop listened to all of it. Then she looked at Sloane directly for the first time. "Mrs. Halloran," she said, "you filed a petition to dissolve the adoption of a child currently in your care 6 months ago without informing your husband. Is that correct?" Sloane met the judge's eyes. "That petition reflects a family decision made after considerable reflection," she said. Judge Bishop wrote something on her notepad, longer than the answer seemed to warrant. Then she issued her ruling. Thorne's motion was denied. The emergency motion for return was denied as well. Temporary guardianship of Eleanor Wren Halloran was granted to me, effective immediately, pending a full evidentiary hearing in 6 days. The gavel came down at 11:14 that morning. I was still sitting at the petitioner's table when my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. A message from Duke. "Gus, we found Marisol. She wants to talk to you." I stood, picked up my briefcase, and walked out into the hallway, toward whatever came next. Syracuse is 94 miles from Hammondsport. Della and I left that same afternoon. She packed sandwiches without being asked, which is what Della does when she knows a drive is going to require more than just driving. She did not ask what I expected to find there. She has learned over 41 years that I do not always have an answer before I arrive somewhere. We drove mostly in silence the interstate running north and east, through hills that grow larger as you leave the lake country behind. A cold, clear afternoon, the kind that looks warmer through a windshield than it turns out to be once you step outside of one. The foster home was a small brick house on a quiet street. Faya Conquil met us at the door. "She's been let down by adults before," Faye said quietly. "More than once. I'm asking you to be patient with her." Marisol was in the living room. 14, though she looked both older and younger at once, the way children do when certain parts of them have been aged by what they have lived through, while other parts remain untouched by it. She sat with her arms folded loosely, taking up exactly as much space as she needed, and no more. "You used to investigate fires," she said. "Faye told me." "I did," I said. "Retired now, about 10 months. Why are you back at it?" "I thought I was finished," I said. Turns out I wasn't. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile. "Duke told me there's another girl," she said. "After me." "Her name is Wren," I said. "She's 11. She's safe. She's staying with me. That's what we're trying to make permanent." Marisol nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" "I want to hear what happened to you," I said. "And I want to ask whether you'd be willing to tell a judge about it." She was quiet a long moment, and I did not fill the silence. "They made me feel like a problem," she said finally. "Not right away. For the first few months it was fine. Then things started changing. She'd say small things that I was difficult, that I didn't fit, that the family had a certain way of doing things and I couldn't adjust. She said it so many times in so many ways that I started believing her." Faye made a small sound from the doorway. Just a breath. "She returned me," Marisol said, "like something bought at a store that didn't work out." She looked at the window, then back at me. "I'll testify. I don't want what happened to me happening to somebody else, because nobody said anything." "Marisol," I said, "I want you to understand what that means. You'll sit in a courtroom and answer questions from a lawyer whose entire job is making your account sound unreliable. It won't be comfortable." "I know what hard is," she said. 3 words, no drama in them at all. Just a fact stated by someone who had earned the right to say it plainly. But something moved across her face as she said it. Quick and gone, almost before I caught it. A flinch beneath the steadiness. I know the difference between someone who has made peace with a hard thing and someone who has only learned to hide what it still costs her. Marisol had not made peace with any of it. Faye set a small card on the table before we left. Our number, for any reason at all. We drove back as the light dropped out of the sky. Della spoke once past Cortland. "She reminded me of Wren," she said. "Not how they look, the way they sit. Like they've learned to be careful how much space they take up." I kept my eyes on the road and did not answer, because nothing would have made that fact smaller than it was. The phone rang at 23 minutes past 7 the morning of the hearing. I was tying my tie in front of the bathroom mirror. Unknown number. "Mr. Halloran." The voice was young male, working hard to sound steadier than it was and almost managing it. "This is Cooper, Sloane's son." "Cooper," I said. "Where are you right now?" "At a friend's house. I told my mom I was going to school early. She doesn't know I'm calling you." I understood immediately what that had cost him. 14 years old, calling his father's father behind his mother's back on the morning of a court hearing. That is not a small thing for a child to do, whatever the reason behind it. "I'm listening," I said. "Take your time." He took a breath, and then he started talking. not in the careful, measured way adults talk when they've rehearsed a thing, but in the uneven, slightly too fast way of someone who has been holding something in for a long while and has finally found a place to set it down. He told me about dinners the way Sloane always served Wren last. Always a little less. Always as an afterthought. He told me about a Saturday morning in October when he'd come downstairs and found Wren alone at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal because Sloane had taken him to the farmer's market and told Wren she could come next time. There had been no next time. He told me about the night before the Lake Placid trip. He'd been in his room, door open, and he'd heard his parents in the hallway. He'd heard Sloane tell Emmett the trip was already planned for 3, that adding Wren would mean changing the room and the budget, that it wasn't worth it for a long weekend. She said Wren was never really ours, Cooper said quietly. I was standing right there. She didn't know I heard her. I sat on the edge of the bed in my half-tied tie and looked at the floor a moment. I should have said something a long time ago, Cooper said when I did not speak right away. I kept thinking it would get better on its own. That maybe I'd heard it wrong, or maybe it was just something people say when they're upset and don't mean. It didn't get better. I just got better at not saying anything. His voice cracked slightly on the last few words. The sound of a boy trying very hard to hold a grown man's steadiness, and finding it did not quite fit yet. You're saying something now, I said. Is that enough? He asked. It's not nothing, I said. It might be the thing that matters most today. Cooper, I said, are you willing to say what you just told me in front of a judge this morning? A pause longer than the others. Not deciding whether he was willing, deciding whether he was able. Those are different questions, and they deserve different amounts of time. Yes, he said finally. I think I have to. I called Ada the moment I hung up. We have a third witness, I said. Cooper Halloran. He heard Sloane say Wren was never really theirs the night before Lake Placid. Can he be here by 8:45? Ada asked. I'll make sure of it, I said. I thought standing there of the night before, the way Wren had come down to my office near midnight, unable to sleep any more than I could. She had sat in the chair against the wall, knees pulled to her chest, and asked me if I thought people could be bad on purpose. I told her I thought some people build a story that lets them feel justified, and that the building of it is sometimes harder to face than plain wrongdoing would be. She had considered that a long moment. Then she said, I'm not mad at Dad. I think he was scared of her. I think she made him scared without him even knowing it was happening. It was, I thought, a very understanding thing for an 11-year-old to say. Understanding and honest both at once, a thing most adults never manage. Before she went back up, she stopped in the doorway, one hand on the frame. Grandpa, she said, whatever happens today, thank you for coming. I will always come, Wren, I said. That is the whole point of having a grandfather. My phone had buzzed once more before I fell asleep. A message from Duke. Marisol called Faye tonight, wanted to back out. Faye talked her through it. She's still coming. I had read that message 3 times before I understood the whole of what it meant. That a 14-year-old girl who had already survived one house that discarded her had come within an hour of deciding the cost of standing up in a courtroom again was more than she could carry, and had chosen in the end to carry it anyway. I thought of the flinch I had seen cross her face in that living room in Syracuse, the one she had covered over so quickly I had nearly missed it. Courage. I have come to understand over 32 years of watching people walk into rooms that frightened them is rarely the absence of that flinch. It is what a person does in the half-second directly afterward. I finished my tie. I went downstairs. Wren was at the table with her orange juice in the collared shirt Della had pressed for her the night before. You look like a judge, she said. I used to be one kind of judge of things, I said. Today, I'm something else. She studied me a moment, the same careful assessment she gave most things, and seemed satisfied with whatever she found. Della set a plate of toast in front of her without being asked, and for a moment, the kitchen held nothing more complicated in it than a girl eating breakfast on an ordinary Tuesday morning, which was, I understood, exactly the kind of morning we were fighting to make possible for her, over and over, for the rest of her life. We drove to the courthouse together, the three of us. Cooper waiting on the porch of a friend's house 3 blocks from his own, wearing a shirt slightly too large at the shoulders that he had pressed himself. He got into the car without speaking. At the first red light, he asked, "Is she going to be okay?" "Yes," I said. "She is going to be okay." He nodded and looked out the window at the town going past, and said nothing else the rest of the way. The courtroom was full by 9 o'clock. A court reporter sat to the left of the bench. 2 caseworkers from the county occupied the 3rd row, folders open on their laps. Emmett sat behind Ada's table, hands folded, not looking at Sloane. She sat beside Thorne in a charcoal blazer, posture, straight expression, composed. I sat beside Ada. Wren was home with Della. Before I left that morning, she had asked if I thought it would go well. I told her I thought it would. She had nodded and gone back to her crossword puzzle. And after everything that week, that single nod was the most composed thing I witnessed from anyone that whole day. Judge Bishop reviewed the file in silence for 3 minutes. Then she looked up. "We are here for the evidentiary hearing in the matter of Eleanor Wren Halloran," she said. "Counsel, are both parties ready?" "Ready, Your Honor," Ada said. "Ready," Thorne said. Marisol took the stand first, in a dark green sweater, hands folded on the railing. She spoke for 11 minutes without stopping, without once looking toward Sloane. She described sitting at the far end of the dinner table while the rest of the family clustered at the other end. She described school events attended for other children, never for her. She described the morning it ended a folded paper with a new caseworker's name on it, no one helping carry her bag to the car. Thorne's cross ran 8 minutes. When he suggested her memory might have been shaped by resentment, she looked at him and said, "I was 7. I understood enough." Cooper took the stand next. His collared shirt, ironed by his own hand that morning, sat slightly large at the shoulders. He described the differences at the dinner table the Saturday, with the cereal bowl, the Lake Placid reservation with his own name on it from the start, and Wren's never added. Then Ada asked about the night before the trip. Cooper looked at Judge Bishop directly. "My mother said Wren was not really ours," he said. "Those were her exact words. I was in the hallway outside the kitchen. She didn't know I was there." No one in the room moved. "I stayed quiet too long," he said. "I kept thinking things would get better on their own. They didn't. I should have said something sooner." Sloane took the stand at 10:30. Ada walked her through both adoption timelines, Marisol's placement in 2018, Wren's in 2022. The dissolution petition for Marisol filed in January 2021. The petition for Wren filed 6 months ago without Emmett's knowledge. Sloane confirmed both filings. "Was Emmett present when the petition for Wren was submitted?" Ada asked. A pause, 3 seconds. "He was aware of the general direction." "Was he present?" Ada said. "Yes or no?" "No." Ada asked permission to play a recorded call. Judge Bishop allowed it. 37 seconds. Sloane's voice came through the courtroom speakers, level and cold. "Emmett will come back to me. He always does. And when he does, you will never see that girl again." The room did not move. Judge Bishop looked at Sloane over the rims of her glasses and held the look. Thorne rose. "Your Honor, the context of that call—" "Sit down, Mr. Thorne," Judge Bishop said, flat and final. She set her pen down. "I have heard enough for now. We will recess 15 minutes. When court resumes, I will deliver my ruling. I straightened my tie in the hallway and did not sit down the entire 15 minutes. Marisol stood near the window with Faye looking out at the parking lot, and I went and stood beside her a moment. You did the hardest part already, I told her. I know, she said. She did not look away from the window. I still don't know how it's going to land. Neither do I said. But you told the truth in a room built to test whether you would. That part's already finished, whatever comes next. She almost smiled at that, the same not quite smile from her living room in Syracuse. Judge Bishop returned at 11 minutes past 11. The room rose, then settled. She opened her folder, did not look up for a long moment. Then she set it aside. I have presided over family court for 22 years, she said. I have reviewed hundreds of custody matters and more adoption dissolutions than I care to count. What I am about to say reflects the full weight of the evidence presented this morning and the documented record compiled over the past 6 days. She looked out at the courtroom. The petition filed by Sloan Halloran to dissolve the adoption of Eleanor Wren Halloran is denied in its entirety. This is not a procedural denial. The evidence before this court establishes a deliberate and sustained pattern of emotional neglect directed specifically at Wren, while her adoptive brother received consistent preferential treatment across housing, meals, activities, and attention over a documented period of 14 months. The court finds the testimony of Marisol Vega credible, consistent, and corroborated by the county's own records. The court finds the testimony of Cooper Halloran credible and notes for the record that his presence here today required a degree of courage this court does not take lightly. The court further finds the recorded telephone call placed by Sloan Halloran deeply troubling, not merely for its content, but for what it reveals about the deliberate nature of the conduct at issue. She paused. Mrs. Halloran, please stand. Sloan stood forward, rising beside her. This matter is being referred to the district attorney's office for review of potential charges, including endangerment and the filing of a fraudulent petition with county services. You are ordered to have no unsupervised contact with Eleanor Wren Halloran pending that review. Sloan sat her hands going still on the table in a way I recognized. Mr. Halloran, please stand. Emmett rose. The court recognizes you were not a knowing participant in either dissolution filing. The evidence establishes, however, that a sustained pattern of differential treatment occurred in your household, and that your absence, whether through inattention or avoidance, contributed to the harm done to your daughter. The court orders mandatory family counseling, minimum 12 months. You are permitted supervised visitation beginning next week, subject to review after 60 days. Emmett nodded once and sat. August Halloran, please stand. I stood. The emergency guardianship of Eleanor Wren Halloran, granted 6 days ago, is hereby made permanent, pending formal review in 90 days. This court has reviewed your record and the conduct you have demonstrated throughout this proceeding. It is the finding of this court that Wren is precisely where she needs to be. The gavel came down at 11:19 that morning. I called Della from the courthouse steps, the November air moving cold and sharp around me. She answered before the second ring. Tell me, she said. It's done, I said. She stays. I heard her set the phone down without hanging up. I heard 4 footsteps cross the kitchen floor. Then I heard her say quietly, without any performance in it at all, Wren, he called. You stay, sweetheart. You stay with us. I did not hear what Wren said back, but I heard the silence that followed, and I have spent 32 years learning to read silences. That one needed no interpretation at all. Marisol found me on the courthouse steps before I reached the bottom. Faye a few paces behind her, already heading for the car. Did it go okay? Marisol asked. It went okay, I said. She nodded slowly, and something in her shoulders came down half an inch. A weight I had not fully registered until I watched it leave her. Good, she said, and walked on toward Faye's car without saying anything more. Which was, I had come to understand, about her exactly enough. I stood on those steps a moment longer. 32 years of walking into other people's worst days behind me. And for the first time in all of them, I had walked out the other side of one, carrying my own family instead of somebody else's file. Then I buttoned my coat and went to bring Wren the news in person. The tin box sits on the windowsill of Wren's room now, not locked away in a drawer, not hidden. Just there in the ordinary daylight where a person keeps things she has decided are safe to look at. The scorch marks have not faded. They will not. Some mornings the sun catches the blackened lid at a certain angle, and for just a moment it almost looks like something still smoldering, though nothing inside it has burned in a very long while. For most of her short life, Wren believed a simple, terrible arithmetic. That love was a thing you earned, kept in a ledger, and could just as easily lose. That being chosen once did not mean being chosen again, not without proof, not without cost. I believed something almost as simple in my own way, that reading the truth correctly was the whole of the work, that once the facts were laid out end to end, they would speak for themselves. We were both wrong and both right, in the particular way that only becomes visible once you have lived all the way through it. The truth was never enough on its own, and she was never required to earn what she already was. I think about that most on the ordinary evenings now, the ones with nothing dramatic in them at all, just supper and dish towels and a girl doing homework at the kitchen table, like it is the safest, most unremarkable thing in the world, which I suppose, by the grace of God, it finally is. I think God does not measure a family by blood alone, and I think God has a particular tenderness for the ones who wait too long at a door before somebody finally opens it. I am not a man who talks easily about faith, but I have come to believe that showing up again and again, without condition, is the closest thing to it that I know how to practice. Here is the question I keep turning over, the one I suspect you already know the shape of. If you have ever loved a child who was not born to you, or been that child yourself, waiting to find out if you were staying. If a knock came at your door at 1 a.m, would you open it before you knew the whole story? Would you ask the question first, or would you simply let someone in out of the cold? I would love to hear your answer in the comments below. And if any part of this found its way into your chest tonight, stay with us. There are more stories like Wren's still waiting to be told.